Hello, everybody. It is Steve, your friendly neighborhood lawn gnome. Welcome back to another episode over here on That's Comical. And of course, if you're watching and it happens to be a Wednesday, happy new comic book day. And of course, I've got Andy here. Andy, it is great to see you again and have another great comic book themed discussion with you today.
I'm really excited about it, and not only another comic themed discussion, but yet another Superman discussion, as has been
Well,
our
yeah.
move recently.
Well, yeah, I never would have actually expected the fact that we would actually keep this going through the rest of the 85th anniversary year of the Man of Steel. I guess the $1 million question is, are we doing this with Batman next year, being that it's Batman's 85th anniversary next year?
I think we're obligated to now.
All right, well, then what we got to do is we got to pick out some good stories to read, hopefully ones that will not be so time consuming. But yeah, I mean, look, it's kind of funny that 2 days from now of this recording, it will be Batman Day, but we're still going to be talking about Superman because we can. But it's just amazing that we've actually started this journey, you and I, with the character profile of Superman, and we've done a couple of must-be-reads. I have a feeling that there's going to be another at least two of them before the year is over.
hmm
But I think the most interesting thing is, like, I'm taking a look back at my beginnings with comic books, and I am pretty sure that you actually helped me browse through my original two comic boxes when I finally brought them from my parents to my house. And it was just amazing to look through that and see the lack of Superman that there was. But then again, it was a very small collection, which is now starting to take over my lower level of the house,
Yep.
unfortunately and fortunately at the same time. But it's amazing to know that even though Superman is a character that I have appreciated and loved for so many years, I never realized just how many great Superman stories there are,
hmm
because it's just that they give us this character in so many different ways and on so many different levels. And the must be read story that we're going to be talking about tonight is no different.
Exactly. And it's funny you say that because obviously I remember going through those first two boxes, what feels like a lifetime ago now, since the collection has expanded so much since then. But I know that Dan Jurgens kind of holds a special place for you. I know you're really, really do love his work. So I think this is going to be a really fun one for that reason too, the character aside.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, Dan Jurgens, my first introductions of him were, of course, the comic book story of Superman that shocked the world when I was collecting, and that was The
hmm
Death of Superman. But after
Exactly.
all the stuff that I've been reading, particularly from Dan Jurgens and what he's done for Superman, I will definitely say at this point in time, I think maybe The Death of Superman and Reign of the Superman might be a little overrated, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, we're talking about a Dan Jurgens story, and that, of course, is the eight issue miniseries Superman, Lois and Clark, of course, written by Dan Jurgens and art by Lee Weeks. And before we go into this story, I just want to give you all a very interesting scenario. So this story comes out at probably one of the worst points in time for Superman at the very beginning of the 21st century. Because we're talking about a story coming out in the middle of the very much hated, and I don't think that that's an over exaggeration, a very hated era of DC Comics for many, the New 52,
hmm
particularly with what was going on with Superman. And on top of that, you just come off of a terrible big event, Convergence,
hmm
where Brainiac is the big baddie, and it involves a whole bunch of stuff that a lot of people say just didn't really seem to make sense. I mean, I never read Convergence, so I honestly don't know. But the interesting thing is, who would have thought in a million years that the aftermath of Convergence would lead to one of the most beloved Superman runs that would go finishing up the New 52, starting up the DC Rebirth era, and the rest is history, thanks to Dan Jurgens, and Peter Tomasi. And for Dan Jurgens, it all started with this opportunity that he had to come back to the world of Superman and give us a story that we never saw before.
And we talked about this a little bit for people who haven't seen the last video we did. The character profile of Superman. We talked about kind of the weird place that Superman was in at this point in time. That not just the character, but the book itself and the reception of it. And I think that this story really is what people were clamoring for, which is the Superman that they knew and loved. And I think that it gets delivered to us in a way that renews the character, while also bringing it back to its roots. So I'm a big fan of this story. I'm excited to talk about this story more, but I do think it's important for us to kind of center it in where it was in comics at the time. This was a true, return to form and a rebirth of the character.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was very interesting because I didn't even know that this story existed until I started getting back into comics in 2019. And that was when I actually found out, oh my God, Superman has a son. And that was also when I realized that Brody from Mallrats was all wrong. Lois Lane can have Superman's baby. I actually just thought of that joke literally 5 minutes ago. I'm not kidding. But no, I didn't know that this story existed. I didn't know what it would eventually churn out as time went on, thanks to Dan Jurgens and Peter Tomasi, who would later on join him after this specific story. But the story basically begins after Convergence, as I said. And in Convergence, at the very end, the person who was able to stop Brainiac in regards to the destruction of the multiverse was the original Superman and the original Lois Lane. And when the battle is done, this Superman and Lois Lane are rewarded. And their reward is you have the ability to live on any of these Earths in the multiverse that you want to live on. And they happen to choose the world of the New 52. And the reason why they choose this New 52 world is because there's already a Superman and there's already a Lois Lane. We're about to have a baby. Let's take this opportunity to actually live our lives in peace in a secluded area where no one knows who we are, even taking on a new name. Ironically, they are now Clark and Lois White, and they welcome their son John Kent into the world, who of course was not called John Kent at the time, but that's who it is. And this story just elevates Superman back. He brings the fans back. John Kent becomes one of the most beloved new characters in DC until certain circumstances caused him to be where he is today. But people always now, interestingly, even though this character is really not so old, they really feel nostalgic for him many, many times. And they go back to this story and the, stories like Super Sons and other stories that are very closely connected to Superman, Lois, and Clark. And of course, while they're settled in this world and they're having a good life, that itch, it starts to attack Lois and Clark. And Lois still wants to do her reporting, and Superman still wants to be the savior and do the right thing. But the question is, how do we do this when there's already a Superman and a Lois Lane? And more importantly, how do we keep this from our son until he's ready? And that's the part of the story that hits home for me right off the bat. The fact that Superman is willing to protect his son from the truth, even though he's dying to tell him.
And I will say this story, taking a bird's eye look at it, This is a small story. All
Yeah.
right. This is not a the world is ending, crisis event, right? This is a very small story about Lois and Clark finding their way to fit in the world, a new world, but finding a way to fit in. And it's explicitly about how to not be involved. And
While
obviously,
being involved
well,
in a
being
certain
involved,
degree.
because they're them, the idea of let's go to a world where there's already a Superman so that we can like kind of play second fiddle and sit in the background and not worry about stuff. Obviously, Clark can't let that go for more than 5 minutes. I mean, Lois has a scrapbook that we see in the story of all of Clark's, unattributed exploits on this new world. But I just wanted to say you're right, that the well, the fatherhood stuff resonates greatly and is some of the most interesting stuff in it, and the trying to keep it from John and all of that sort of stuff. But that's the heart of it, right? And I just think it's important to note at the very beginning of our discussion that that's the heart of it because this is a small story. It's one that it's almost funny to me is as beloved as it is. I mean, it's great and I love it. Um, but it's just interesting for us to be talking about a story that isn't an event, is not some, big clash of, face villains from the rogues gallery. It's not some defining, this is a small story. And I think there's a place for that. And it's really interesting to do that with Superman.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's ironically, I'm pretty sure by the time that this story was being written, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't know the truth until I actually met Dan Jurgens in person. Although the funny thing is, I really should have asked Peter Tomasi that question when
Hmm.
I actually met him few months ago. But obviously, there must have been a plan in play because, truthfully, at this time, the new 52 was pretty much coming to an end and Rebirth was starting to be prepared. I mean, I'm pretty sure that when I was looking through this 8-issue miniseries, there were already advertisements for Rebirth. So
Hmm.
clearly, there was a goal in mind. And this, while it is a small story, would eventually become a larger story. But
Hmm.
this story, what's great about it is, you're right, it's small, it's very much self-contained. Like you can literally read this story on its own
Hmm.
and not necessarily read what happens afterwards. You don't have to. There's no thing in the book even that gives you true incentive for it. But I just love this story because of the fact that Superman, is playing second fiddle to the new 52 Superman because and he's sort of fulfilling a goal that he's had in his lexicon, which was he wants to be there to help everybody. So
Hmm.
even though there are times when the new 52 Superman is not able to do these things that Clark is able to jump in and just take care of it for him. It's so funny because this Superman never asks any questions,
Hmm.
and Clark is getting his thrills, if I may say. But what's so interesting about all of that is the fact that he feels that this goal is being fulfilled, but at the same time, even though he knows he's doing the right thing, he still feels a little empty inside
Hmm.
because he's not really able to share it with other people besides his wife. I mean, I think one of the things that I completely forgot about is it's somewhere in the middle of the 8-part story is how he was so eager, like he was yearning to go to the new 52 Batman and talk to him about it.
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
found that so incredible because I think this is one of the most important things about this story is this is also one of the most humanizing versions of Clark that we've ever seen. Like
Hmm.
we all, even though we see him as Superman, we see really more of him as Clark, the
Hmm.
man. And
And I
that's
will
one of the few things I
say,
love.
I will say, I think that's a really great scene. You're right. It falls basically in the middle where he just kind of goes to see Batman. And then when he reports on this to Lois, it's like Lois sees right through it and is just like, Clark, you're looking for a friend. Like that's what this is. You're not doing like recon or something here. you're longing for connection. And he's like, you're enough, John is enough, the family is enough. And she's like, yeah, but people need friends. um
You're also longing for something that you used to have.
yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where he's like, he's reminded it's not your Bruce. And he's like, yeah, I mean, he's a little younger, he's a little faster, but like, I I feel that something in him, it reminds him of that. So it's an interesting moment to choose to put in.
Speaking of Batman, I have to stop everything and ask you this question. So there's at our local comic shop, there's a question of the day on New Comic Book Day. I have to ask you this question, and I want people to hear this question because I'd love to see what people might actually write in the comments if they do. Who would win in a popularity contest, Batman or pizza?
So here's why my answer is Batman. I'm not aware of pizza bringing fans out to lead to a top 10 grossing media franchise at the movies. So are there
Hmm.
more people who like pizza than there are people who are intimately familiar with Batman? Probably. Are those pizza fanatics going out and wearing memorabilia with pizza all over it? Not as often.
See, I instantly said pizza, and maybe that was just because of the fact that it was lunchtime. But then
Fair
again,
enough.
I don't know. And yeah, and that reminds me of another question. What does Superman eat? Does he eat pancakes or waffles? I think I answered the question. He would eat a plain old stack of pancakes with a cup of black instant coffee and not complain a bit.
That sounds about right. Yeah. That one we just see completely eye to eye on. Yep.
Yeah. So of course, the other thing that we also need to talk about that's so interesting about Clark and Lois in this world is the fact that they know that these heroes are very young and very inexperienced, and they're noticing a lot of things in this world that also took place in their world, which is one of the main reasons why Lois decides to become this infamous writer X, writing for the Daily Planet and also trying to publish a book for the purposes of taking down Bruno Mannheim and Intergang. And of
Mhm.
course, the main objective in Superman when it comes to the main antagonist is he notices that a spaceship is coming back to Earth, and in that spaceship is a man named Hank Henshaw. And he remembers this specific person who would eventually become a cyborg Superman, and he believes that this guy has to be stopped. So I think the most interesting thing about these two elements in the story is when we see these things unfold, do they in fact have the exact same outcome as they did on their original world? And what are the consequences?
Mhm. Yeah, that's one of the most fun parts of this, and it's one of the parts of it that starts to expand outside of the self-contained story itself, or at the very least makes it rewarding for people who have that deeper background with the character already. Um, so there's also an element that isn't really addressed in the book itself, I guess, but something that I was thinking and is kind of alluded to by Clark at one point, what role they play in manifesting some of these things. I
Mhm.
am left with the question of, had Clark not intervened in various ways, would things have played out the same way or not, since he's using his own kind of history from a different version of Earth to inform that. Anyway, I don't mean to go too far beyond the topic of the video, but I think that's an interesting thing to think about. And I think it primarily comes up with the entire cyborg Superman type
Yeah.
thing, and it's where that might be going.
I mean, I gotta be honest with you. With the reread, I still think that that might have been the weakest part of the story for me. I mean, it was
Yeah,
just a very, I don't know, maybe it was just because of the fact they had to add some additional elements because I don't know how the story would have been perceived if it was just about Clark going off as Superman and then being reintroduced in his family life. But,
yeah,
those parts of the story are fantastic, but I guess if I were to figure out what the purposes of these antagonistic pieces of the story are, I think it's also just a matter of Clark trying to find his relevancy in this world. I think that's really
yeah.
what it is.
Yeah, yeah, I agree with that completely. And for the record, I do agree. It's kind of the weakest part of the story. And that's because the thing that resonates with people and that's most interesting is just watching them try to fit in with the normal life, the failing, but the fitting in and re-examining who they are. So it's almost like it's unnecessary. It doesn't harm the story. But it's very funny when you're reading it, just being like, this is not what I'm explicitly here for. This
Yeah.
kind of feels like the part that's making it part of a larger whole. When Dan Jurgens probably would have been happy writing the entirely self-contained story that was the frame of it.
Yeah, and then of course there was the character blank, and
Hmm.
it's just trying to figure out. I mean, this was a character that he seemed to have encountered before he became a part of this world. So I'm
Yeah.
gonna guess that blank was probably a character that showed up in Convergence. Again, I haven't read Convergence.
Hmm.
I personally have no intentions on reading Convergence, and I don't know, like I can understand this character because I think the interesting thing about this specific antagonist, and I think he's the strongest of the
Hmm.
antagonists in this story, is also because of the fact that here's a brand new evil and Clark knows that he's dangerous. So
Hmm.
he creates his own brand new Fortress of Solitude in a very different element that we're familiar with. I love the fact that it's just like a cave somewhere in the deep dark forest somewhere,
Yeah.
which is so interesting. But he now believes that, along with Hank Henshaw, and I guess that's where this really bleeds into it, it's because I don't want these evils to escape into this world
Hmm.
because I don't know if these new heroes are ready for such powerful characters. And yet, this is where I'm trying to figure out, did he not read up on this world's history? I mean, for crying out loud, the Justice League's first big villain was freaking Darkseid, and
Yeah.
they beat him. So I have a feeling this is a little bit of naivete on Clark's end of on the spectrum here, but you see that his intentions are good.
Hmm.
He doesn't want the world to experience these evils. So he is preventing them from even happening.
Hmm.
And then there's that other antagonistic thing, that supernatural being that's looking for the stone. I'm just going to say
Yeah.
that I don't know what that was all about. It made no sense, and there was no threat. I just don't get that whole
it
piece.
it was there. It was there to be the final page in every issue because somebody said you got to tie this into the story that's coming next. That's all
Mm,
that was. That's all that
yeah,
was.
yeah, pretty much. But let's just address the part that I know everybody wants to talk about, and it's the main reason why people love this story so dearly, and that's the introduction of John Kent.
Hmm.
I mean, this is such a wonderful character. This is everything you could ever possibly want for Superman and Lois's child to be. He's a good kid. He's not perfect. He sometimes gets into trouble, but he's very, very curious. And at the same time, he is very much innocent. And I think that's one of the main reasons why this is the reason why Superman, Lois, and Clark is ever so popular, because this character, John Kent, was a true game changer for DC.
And he's the son that you would love to believe that Lois and Clark would have. Because, like you said, he's not perfect. He gets in a little trouble sometimes. It's understandable why, maybe, but he's got that heart of gold that Clark has. And not for nothing, he's got that investigative spirit that Lois has, which I mean, Clark has, but it's not the definitive part of his character,
It's
right?
by no means, he is by no
It,
means what Lois is,
Clark even
tenfold.
jokes about it at one point when he I forget, there's one issue where he says something like, you were a real reporter, one of the best. And he like stops for a second. He's like, I guess we. And
Yeah.
like,
Nah, he that was his alter ego. He's
yeah,
Superman, and that's
yeah.
what he is. That's what he is basically to everybody, to himself even. Like you remember that scene from Kill Bill when Bill talks about, when Spider-Man is not wearing his costume, he's Peter Parker. When Batman is not wearing his costume, he's Bruce Wayne. But when Clark Kent is wearing his suit and glasses, he's not Clark Kent. That's Superman's disguise. What do you think of Superman's look in this book? I really like Superman with a beard.
Yeah.
I mean it's so interesting because we had mullet Superman in the 90s, and then we have Superman with a beard and a black suit. And I also love because of the fact that it's also a Hank Henshaw story, I kind of love the scene where Lois gives him the costume. He says, I always thought that black suited you. Because
Yeah.
he did wear the black costume during Reign of the Supermen, which I thought
Yeah.
was a really good callback, and it made perfect sense because it was a Dan Jurgens story.
It was a really fun nod. I liked it a lot. And I do love the look of Superman in this one. I think it's funny. I also like the joke about, well, I guess I'm keeping the beard now.
Yeah.
Which, yeah, fine, is a cool look. My favorite thing about the introduction of the black suit in this was the opportunity for John to react to the bright colored original like suit at the
Mhm.
end of the story. I love
Right.
I love I love the incredulousness with which he says you wore a cape. I love that because it's so pure, and it reminds us of who this Superman is that we are with right now. It's like, you wore a cape? Yeah, this Superman wore a cape. Like, I really love that for what it does for John.
Right. So, of course, we get this really small, yet to a certain degree, somewhat minorly epic story. But of course, the main plot of this story is really about John Kent discovering the truth about his dad.
Hmm.
And the entire ride is simply brilliant.
Hmm.
Those parts of the story really are true gems, some of the best comic book writing that I personally have ever experienced. I mean, you never would have read this story unless I told you about it. I
No,
mean,
I really don't think so.
it's because of the fact that it's also just one of those Superman stories that nobody ever really talks about. It's like, you want to talk about, when people talk about the greatest Superman stories of all time, they say Kingdom Come, whatever happened to the Man of Tomorrow. They even say the death of Superman. But I never, ever hear about Superman, Lois, and Clark. And it's a darn shame because this is such a down to earth human story about Superman being a hero and being a family man. And the story of how John uncovers the truth is the best driving part of the story, because when you take a look at John and you take a look at his personality, he's drawn to Superman. He loves the Superman that is in his world. And every single time, he's even doing reports about Superman, which I find really, really cool. And Clark, very much like wanting to talk to the New 52 World's Batman, he's like just like clenching his hands on his knees saying, I have to tell him. I have to tell him. And unfortunately, even though you got to give him props for keeping it a secret for this long, with all the things that John and Lois had to go through until there was no way to keep it hidden from John, the outcome at the beginning, it's heartbreaking. It really is, because this young boy basically looks at his parents straight in the face and says, you lied to me.
Hmm.
Why did you
Yeah.
lie to me?
It is really heartbreaking, and it's one of those things that reminds you again of all the Lois that's in him. And I know this
Yeah.
is a Superman story, but it makes me want to say that again. We were just talking about how she's the reporter, right? Clearly. And it's that aspect of it. It's that he seeks the truth and that he expects the truth at the very least from his parents. And it is heartbreaking. And while he does say that he does understand why, it's heartbreaking and you don't want it for him to have happened.
Yeah, especially because the main reason why he gets so upset is not just because of all the trouble that he and Lois got into during this time frame, but it's also because of the fact that he does in fact discover that he does have powers. And that
Hmm.
was something that Lois and Clark were sort of anticipating, but at the same time, they weren't sure.
Hmm.
Was he going to have powers? Was he not going to have powers? And I think that's also something that the reader is reading throughout the entire time and thinking the same thing. Is
Hmm.
Superman's son going to have superpowers? Or is he
Hmm.
not? Or is he going to just be a normal kid living on Earth, even though he is half
Have
Kryptonian
Kryptonian.
and half human? And to a certain degree, it's sort of obvious, like you knew he was going to develop powers, especially because he's got Kryptonian DNA in him. It's virtually impossible
Hmm.
for him not to have powers if he's got Kryptonian blood in his system. He's going to absorb those yellow rays. It's scientifically impossible for him to be a dud.
But there is that question, and I think that the story does a good job of leaving it as a lingering question for a little bit. At the very least, we don't know when the powers are going to manifest. And there's no guarantee that in this 8-issue arc that we are going to see the powers that we suspect could manifest within this 8-issue arc. Especially given the future that the character would have and would go on to have longevity with fans. There was no guarantee we were going to see it now.
Yeah. So
And
how
we
he
saw it
dis-
a little bit, but
and how he discovers his powers is, correct me if I'm wrong, but because of the fact that it's in the presence of Lois Lane, isn't that a little nod to Superman 2?
I guess that's true. Yeah. I guess that's true. I hadn't
That
thought of
yeah,
it
that's
that way.
another reason why I kind of love this
Yeah.
story, because there are so many callbacks to Superman's lore, and I think that's another
Hmm.
reason why it's one of my favorite stories, just because of the fact that Dan Jurgens had written so many Superman stories before this, but the fact that he was able to take this small story and really put so much nostalgia
Yeah.
into it, I think that's what makes it so great in my eyes.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's with good reason. I mean, we're watching Clark discover how to reintegrate himself into a different world, and so that kind of story, by its very nature, kind of makes us need to reflect on who he is and where he came from in order to find a place of belonging. So you're right that it's while they're fun little Easter eggs and they're interesting little nods, they actually serve a narrative purpose too.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about that, but you're right.
And I also do love the fact that, like, the minute he discovers that he actually does have the powers, he's like, I'm gonna fly, I can fly. No, I can't.
No, I
Like,
can't.
you see, that's a very cliche thing to happen, but you're glad that it does, because
Yeah,
it's something that you want to see John go through.
it's one of those things where it's like if you're writing it, it's like you owe it to yourself to write that scene. It's like, what are we
Yeah.
doing here if we don't do John tries to fly?
Yeah, and I think the way that the story ends is you couldn't ask for a better ending, because
No.
you sort of get Superman being revealed about who he is from his parents when he discovered who he was. It's very simple, but instead of it's very similar, but instead of going into a barn and seeing the spaceship, he basically goes down into the basement, Superman, and he brings up the chest and he shows John his original Superman
Mhm.
costume. And that's very much the ending that you want. And then, of course, at the end, John puts on the cape and he does actually lift up above the ground a little bit.
Mhm.
So we're basically left with, if anything else, there's anything that you want to have as incentive to read more, it's like everyone wants to see, what is John Kent going to do now that he knows that he's Superman's son and knows that he has powers.
Mhm. Mhm. And I love it. It reads to me the bringing up the old suit from the basement reads to me like finding Clark's ship You know what I mean? It's
Mhm.
John's version of that. It's the it's the physical object that's the manifestation of, hey, look, this is where you come from. We're showing you the truth of it for the first time. And it's his version of it. And I found it very impactful and it really resonated with me. Um, and it's shooting fish in a barrel, the kid stuff. I mean, I have a 5 month old now, so the dad stuff was really landing for me this read
Yeah.
through.
I really hope that, when you're, because it's so interesting. I'm really curious to see what role comic books will play in our world as our children get older, because
Yeah.
you fortunately have a son, and there's a very good chance that he might actually enjoy comic books. But I've got a daughter. I don't really know what her attitude is going to be towards superheroes. But like I
Comic
said,
fandom is not gendered, my guy.
I,
It'll
I
be
know that. I know that. But like I said, if she reads them, I'll be very thankful for
yeah.
that. But if she doesn't, as long as she's okay with the fact that I do, that's all that I
Yeah.
ask.
I can
So,
understand that.
so my question to you is, because I don't think we ever actually asked this question together. We've both read a great many stories that are Superman based. And there's still a whole bunch more that we do need to read and discuss. I mean, I personally feel that Secret Identity is one that we should read and discuss this year.
Mhm.
But I know you've read a great deal of Superman stories. Do you think that this is your favorite? Is it truly one of the best? Is it your personal favorite out of all of them? Because even it's right now interesting for me, because I think in regards to my favorite Superman stories, this is definitely my personal top one. And if it's not, it's like neck and neck with Superman's Secret Identity. Those are my two favorite Superman stories of all time. I mean, for a long time, Superman, Lois, and Clark was my number one, but then I read Secret Identity, and I'm like, well, now I'm not so sure anymore. But what's your attitude?
I'm sitting here thinking it feels like a weird one to say is my favorite. Because of the aforementioned small story and what sticks with me and what I think about when I think of this story is not action, is not even like, oh, keeping their secret identity. It's really just watching them interact with John. And can that be my favorite Superman story? Maybe, I guess. I mean, I don't like Superman because he has laser vision. That's like not the defining thing of why I like him. Um, so I'm gonna leave with the non-committal take of I don't know. Um, but I love it. And I think that's enough. And I think that's what I'd want to have viewers of this episode come away with thinking this is a really different Superman story.
Yeah,
This is you're probably never going to make a like Zack Snyder version of Lois and Clark, right? Um, it's a very different kind of story, but it's very impactful, and I think it'll stick with you. And I also think part of what makes it great is the way that it'll make you think about the character from here out. If you have trouble humanizing Clark because you see him as too much man of tomorrow and not enough man, I think this will make you understand the personal struggles he deals with on a deeper level. So it's a great story.
yeah, I will
Yeah.
piggyback on that exactly with what you. I will piggyback on that, because I will say that if you've never read a Superman comic in your life, this, and if this is the only Superman comic that you ever read in your life, it's a great one. I would probably recommend this one or Superman Secret Identity, just because I think Secret Identity is very interesting, because similarly to Lois and Clark, it's the outsider looking in.
Yeah.
That's a big theme of Superman, Lois, and Clark. And Secret Identity, even though I know you haven't read it yet, it's a very similar theme.
Yeah. It's interesting. It sounds crazy to say that this would be a good introduction to Superman because it relies on there's another Superman. Um,
Yeah.
but it's I actually think I agree with you that it could be a really great first Superman story for someone who is, as we talked in our character profile, aware of Superman through general pop culture. So if you have absorbed kind of a conceptualization of the Superman character from pop culture, but haven't actually read comics, this will be a really great like twist to what you think you know of who Clark is, without being a twist. I don't mean to say it'll like warp it forever. It's like it'll make you understand the fundamental humanity behind the cape that you have in mind. Um, yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, because the most important thing is Superman, Lois and Clark, it can be a standalone story, and it doesn't have to be a standalone story.
Hmm.
If you read the first pages of the first issue and you're curious about what happened during Convergence, then feel free to go read Convergence if you so well choose to. If
Hmm.
you want to see where this story continues, then feel free to read The Last Days of Superman and read all the way up to Superman Reborn and go as further back or as further forward as you want.
Hmm.
But it is a good one-off. It's a good jumping on point.
Hmm.
I mean, if it did anything for me, is it just made me want to read more Superman comics and find
Hmm.
out more about where are and what are the great Superman stories of all time. I mean, I
Hmm.
have already read Kingdom Come many years prior, but there were some stories that I didn't even know existed, like Jeff Johns' Superman Up, Up, and Away, and I loved that story so much. That is another very interesting take
Hmm.
on Superman. And I always knew about Superman, Whatever Happened to the Man of Tomorrow by
Yeah,
Alan Moore.
yeah.
And that's a very interesting story on its own. And there's so many other great Superman stories to find. And that's why I'm glad that you and I, Andy, chose on the 85th anniversary of Superman to bring some of these stories forward and let people
Hmm.
know, we all know who Superman is in some shape or form, but if you want to go back to where it all began in the pages of comics, where do we go? That's what this is all about.
Hmm. Hmm. And I think you're right that this is a really great jumping in point explicitly because it's a transition period for the character you're jumping into. You're right that there's stories you convergence, whatever, or if you want to go forward into the world of rebirth after the new 52, like you can do that. This is a farewell, but also a new beginning. Um, and so it's really interesting. So I mean, we can talk about the quality of the stories around it, sure, but there's more and more things that are clicking with me, making it a good idea for this to be a great jumping on point for somebody,
Yeah.
because there's really a lot to sink your teeth into.
Yeah, and I mean, I will also say that I am someone who did move a little bit further because, the matter of
Hmm.
fact, when I first heard about Superman, Lois, and Clark, was learning about Superman Reborn.
Hmm.
So I sort of worked backwards in a certain degree, but I read everything forward. Like, I didn't read Superman Reborn until I found out that Superman, Lois, and Clark is the place to start with this specific Superman Rebirth storyline. And
Hmm.
Dan Jurgens and Peter Tomasi, holy God, considering that Superman may have been at the lowest point in his legacy, thank goodness these two guys were asked to take on Superman
Yeah,
and not only give us some incredible stories. The one thing that we have not mentioned, these guys redeemed the new 52 Superman.
yeah,
That was the most important thing that they did. They took a Superman run that was horrible. They gave it probably the most unexpected but most appreciated endings you could ever
yeah.
ask for. And at the end of the day, when the two of them are in the rebirth world and we're up to Superman Reborn, they officially cap off the redeeming story of the New 52 Superman, and it's
Hmm.
done beautifully,
Hmm.
absolutely beautifully.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that can definitely be said is one of the greatest things that they contributed to this character outside the book itself, just talking about the legacy of it.
After they were both thrown off of the Superman titles, and that's
Hmm.
not a bad choice of words. They were asked to stop writing. They were thrown off the books, and then Superman was given over to Brian Michael Bendis, and it was just such a shame because there were so
Yeah.
many people that were so upset with what he did to Superman, and worse, more, what he did to John. That was
Hmm.
the thing that basically was unforgivable.
Hmm.
And I'm just glad that Philip Kennedy Johnson and Josh Williamson, they're really working their asses off to try and get people back on board
Yeah.
with Superman, because the rug was literally swept out from under it.
Hmm.
And they're anticipating a big thing for Superman in 2024. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm unfortunately not reading any Superman at the very moment.
Hmm. Hmm.
But from what I'm hearing, there's some good stuff right now in the Superman title and the Action Comics title. And in October, Superman issue number 7 is going to be the Legacy number 850. So I'm going
Hmm.
to pick that issue up,
Yeah.
because
See where that goes.
they're saying that there's something in there that's going to give you a tease of what's going to happen in 2024. So I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to see what it's all about. I'm not someone who has anything bad to say about Josh Williamson, other than I think DC is very much overworking him and
Hmm.
he's really, really spread thin. But nothing would make me happier than to get Superman back to where he was in the late 2010s, thanks to Dan Jurgens and Peter Tomasi, and having it all start with this story.
Yeah, and I don't think it's impossible. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that'll be an important issue to pick up and see what happens with the character, because we've seen that you can do great things with Superman. You can do great things with Superman in the modern day. And let's see if fans will be there for it. Let's see if people are there for the character.
Well, I think that's going to wrap up another episode of Must Be Read. Andy, I'm really glad that we were able to, I got to be honest with you. I'm just glad that we actually have been managing to find some time,
Yeah,
somewhat on a constant basis, and talking about some great stories and comics. And obviously, when the camera goes off, we're clearly going to be starting to make plans for some other stuff to make. But
exactly.
everybody, I really hope you enjoyed another episode of Must Be Read. And this really is a must be read Superman story. Andy and
Yeah,
I cannot praise this little Superman story enough. So try and get your hands on the trade if you can.
yeah.
Honestly, if you find the floppies, they're not that expensive. But I will say that if you get the floppies, consider yourselves lucky, because once you read the story, you will just be you'll be happy
Yeah.
with this story. That's what it is.
Yeah, no, this is phenomenal, and you're right. Glad we made time. Glad we're continuing to talk about Superman. It has reinvigorated my love for the character, and this is a great one. So thanks everybody for watching.
Yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Be well.